The evening rush had just started at Westwood Diner, and Amy was moving fast, balancing plates, refilling drinks, and forcing a smile despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. She had worked here for 3 years, barely making enough to cover rent. The tips helped, but the manager? He made her life hell. Table 6 is still waiting. Her boss, Greg, barked from behind the counter. "On it!" Amy called back, grabbing the order. But as she turned, her eyes landed on an elderly man sitting in the corner booth. His clothes were old and worn, his hands rough and calloused. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, staring at the menu but never ordering. Amy's heart tightened. She had seen people like him before, hungry, too proud to ask for help. Quietly, she approached his table and smiled. "Hey there, sir. Can I get you anything?" The old man looked up, startled. He hesitated before speaking. "Just a coffee, please?" Amy nodded. "Sure thing. But, She glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "You hungry?" The old man swallowed hard, but didn't answer. That was all the confirmation she needed. "Tell you what," Amy said with a wink. "We had an extra plate made by mistake. You'd be doing us a favor if you took it off our hands." The old man's eyes glistened. "That's very kind of you, miss." Amy just smiled and walked off. She quickly plated up a warm meal: steak, mashed potatoes, and fresh bread. Slipping it onto his table without a charge, she gave him a small nod before walking away. She barely made it 3 steps before a sharp voice cut through the air. "Amy!" Her stomach dropped. Greg was storming toward her, his face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped, eyes darting to the old man's plate. Amy stiffened. I was just helping." "You're giving away food for free!" Greg's voice boomed across the diner. Customers turned to watch. Amy's face burned. "It was just 1 meal." Greg snatched her apron off. "You're done. You're fired." The old man stilled. The entire diner went silent. Amy's heart sank. Just like that, her job, her only source of income, was gone. But as she turned to leave, the old man suddenly stood up. And when he spoke, his voice was clear, powerful, and nothing like before. "No, she's not." Amy's breath caught. Greg frowned. "Excuse me?" The old man reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and tossed it onto the counter. It had one name written on it: Jonathan Pierce. Greg's face turned white. Amy's blood ran cold. Because Jonathan Pierce wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the entire restaurant chain. The CEO. And she had just been fired for helping him. Greg's face drained of color as he stared at the name on the black card. Jonathan Pierce. The man he had just humiliated, the old man he thought was nothing, was the owner of the entire restaurant chain. Amy's heart pounded. She had served thousands of customers over the years, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined helping an undercover CEO. The diner was dead silent. Every single employee and customer was watching, waiting for what would happen next. Greg stammered. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't recognize you." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his entire demeanor different now. Gone was the quiet, hesitant old man. Now he looked sharp, observant, completely in control. "And what would that have changed?" he asked calmly. Greg's mouth opened and closed, searching for an excuse. I wouldn't have fired one of your best employees?" Jonathan finished for him. Greg swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just enforcing company policy." Jonathan chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. It was ice cold. "Interesting," he said, glancing around the diner, "because I own this company, and I don't recall making firing good people for being kind a policy." Amy stood frozen, barely able to breathe. Greg sweat through his shirt. "Mr. Pierce, please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to discuss." Jonathan said, slipping off his old coat. Underneath, his expensive tailored suit gleamed under the diner's lights. You made it very clear how you run this place. And now, he turned to Amy, you're rehired. Amy blinked. What? Jonathan smiled warmly. You heard me. You're back on the team. In fact, he turned back to Greg, his eyes sharp. You're fired. The entire diner gasped. Greg's jaw dropped. Sir, please, Jonathan cut him off. I don't tolerate cruelty in my business, and I especially don't tolerate managers who punish employees for showing basic human decency. Greg's face turned beet red. He turned to Amy, his expression twisting with rage and humiliation. You set me up! He hissed. Amy scoffed. You fired me for feeding a hungry man. You did that all by yourself. Jonathan smirked. She's right. He pointed toward the door. Now get out. Greg had no choice. Humiliated and furious, he stormed out of the diner, slamming the door behind him. Amy let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, and when she looked back at Jonathan, he was already smiling at her. Now, he said, let's talk about your promotion. Amy stared at Jonathan, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Promotion. The entire diner was still stunned from what had just happened. Greg was gone. The cruel boss who had ruled with an iron fist, humiliated and fired in front of everyone. And now the CEO himself was offering her a promotion. Amy swallowed hard. I don't understand. Jonathan chuckled, sliding into the booth he had occupied before. This time, he wasn't playing a struggling old man. Now he carried himself with the air of a man who owned the place. He gestured for her to sit across from him. Come on, Amy, he said, amusement flickering in his eyes. You didn't think I was really here just for a meal, did you? Amy hesitated before slowly lowering herself into the seat. She couldn't believe this was happening. You see, Jonathan continued, lacing his fingers together, I like to visit my businesses in disguise. It's the only way to see how they truly run. If I walk in with a suit, I get a fake show. But when I look like an ordinary customer... His lips quirked. I see the truth. Amy's stomach twisted. And what did you see? Jonathan exhaled. I saw a waitress who treated me with kindness when she thought I had nothing to give her in return. His gaze softened. And I saw a manager who only valued people based on their wallets. Amy bit her lip. I just did what anyone should have done. Jonathan shook his head. You did what few people actually do. She didn't know what to say. So, Jonathan continued, leaning forward. Here's the deal. I don't just want you back on staff. I want you as the new manager. Amy choked on air. Excuse me? Jonathan smiled. You heard me. Around them, the other waiters and cooks gasped. A few whispered among themselves, completely shocked. Amy shook her head quickly. I don't have management experience. You have something more important. Jonathan countered. Integrity. Amy's heart pounded. But, no buts. Jonathan interrupted, sliding a business card across the table. Come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll go over the details. Amy stared at the card. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But why me? She finally asked, her voice small. Jonathan's gaze held something undeniable. Because people like you deserve to win. Amy swallowed hard. For years she had been barely scraping by, trying her best, but never being noticed. And now, the most powerful man in the company had seen her, and everything was about to change. Amy could barely sleep that night. Her mind spun with everything that had happened, the shock of getting fired, the humiliation of being yelled at, and then the unbelievable twist. She had fed a hungry man, only to learn he was the CEO. And now he was offering her a managerial position. It didn't feel real. But when she walked into Pierce Enterprises the next morning, clutching the business card Jonathan had given her, reality hit her hard. The building was massive, polished glass windows, marble floors, employees in designer suits walking past her with purpose. Amy felt out of place. Her uniform from the diner had been replaced with a simple blouse and slacks, the nicest thing she owned. But even now, she felt like she didn't belong here. A receptionist smiled at her. "Miss Amy Walker." Amy nodded nervously. "Mr. Pierce is expecting you. Right this way." Her heart hammered as she followed the receptionist down a sleek hallway. She had never been inside a corporate office before. She had spent her life waiting tables, not sitting in boardrooms. So why had Jonathan chosen her? The receptionist opened a large door and gestured for her to step inside. Amy took a deep breath and walked in. Jonathan sat behind a massive oak desk reviewing a document, but the second he saw her, he smiled. "Right on time," he said. "Have a seat, Amy." She swallowed and carefully sat across from him. I still don't really understand why I'm here." Jonathan chuckled. "You're here because you deserve to be." Amy shook her head. "But I'm just a waitress. I don't have the experience." Jonathan held up a hand. "Amy, let me ask you something. What does a manager do?" She hesitated. "They make sure everything runs smoothly. They lead the team. Keep customers happy." Jonathan nodded. "And what were you doing yesterday?" Amy blinked. "I was taking care of customers, helping my co-workers." Jonathan smirked. "Exactly. You were already acting like a manager. The only difference is no one gave you the title." Amy's chest tightened. She had spent years believing she was only good for one thing, serving food. But now, someone was telling her she could be more. She swallowed hard. "And you really think I can do this?" Jonathan leaned forward. "I know you can." Amy bit her lip. She thought about all the times she had been overlooked, underpaid, mistreated. And now, she had a choice. She could run back to the safety of what she knew. Or she could take a chance on herself. Amy took a deep breath and made her decision. She met Jonathan's gaze and nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'm in." Jonathan's smile widened. "Good," he said, standing up, "because your new career starts now." Amy's heart pounded. This was really happening. Amy's hands were clammy, her heart racing as Jonathan led her through the executive floor of Pierce Enterprises. "Your first order of business," he said, grinning, "is meeting your new team." Amy's stomach twisted. A team? She had never led anyone in her life. She had always been the one taking orders, not giving them. But Jonathan walked with full confidence, as if he already knew she was the right person for this. They stopped in front of a conference room. Through the glass walls, Amy could see 5 well-dressed professionals sitting around a sleek, polished table. Her heart pounded harder. Jonathan pushed open the door. "Everyone, meet your new manager, Amy Walker." 5 heads snapped up. A tall woman in a navy suit frowned. "Sir, no offense, but..." She was a waitress. A man beside her raised an eyebrow. "Does she even have management experience?" Amy felt a familiar sting. She had spent her whole life being looked down on by customers, managers, people who assumed she wasn't good enough. But before she could respond, Jonathan chuckled. "Let me ask you all something," he said, taking a seat. "How many of you have ever worked in a restaurant?" Silence. Jonathan smirked. "I thought so." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Do you know how much leadership it takes to handle a dinner rush? To calm down angry customers, juggle 10 different tasks at once, and make sure every order is right?" The team shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan nodded at Amy. She's been running a business without the title for years. And now, I'm giving her the title she deserves. Amy's chest tightened. He wasn't just standing up for her, he was proving she belonged here. The team fell silent. Finally, the woman in navy sighed. All right, then. She turned to Amy. Welcome to the team. Amy exhaled. Thank you. She had doubted herself, wondered if she was making a mistake. But now she knew. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a leader. Jonathan clapped his hands. All right, Amy, ready for your first meeting? Amy straightened her shoulders. She was terrified, but she was ready. Let's do this, she said. Jonathan smiled proudly, because he already knew she was going to be incredible.